Imagine watching from across a river as your entire army, 80,000 soldiers you personally led from Constantinople, gets slaughtered in front of your eyes while you stand helpless on the far bank. Unable to command, unable to retreat back across the collapsing bridge, unable to do anything except watch 30,000 men die screaming in a single afternoon. September 11, 1697. Sultan Mustafa II stood on the western bank of the Tisza River near Zenta, watching the nightmare unfold in real time as Prince Eugene of Savoy's 40,000-man Habsburg army appeared behind his second. Forces like a ghost materializing from smoke, the Ottomans were caught in the worst possible tactical position, halfway across a river crossing, split into two halves, trapped between the water and an enemy that had force-marched 70 miles in 30 hours to arrive at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. What followed was not a battle. It was systematic annihilation carried out with surgical precision, as Habsburg artillery concentrated fire on the single wooden bridge connecting both banks, causing catastrophic collapse that sent hundreds plunging into the Tisza River wearing full armor that dragged them straight to the bottom like anchors. The bridge didn't just break, it disintegrated under the weight of thousands trying to flee simultaneously, creating a bottleneck of screaming, trampling, drowning chaos where Ottoman soldiers were crushed by their own comrades, shot by Habsburg infantry, or drowned in muddy water that filled their lungs while armor made swimming impossible. By dawn, 30,000 Ottoman casualties littered the battlefield and floated downstream, including Grand Vizier Elmas, Mehmed Pasha, the highest-ranking Ottoman official killed in European combat in that century. The Battle of Zenta didn't just end a campaign, it ended an era of Ottoman expansion and forced the Treaty of Karlowitz that redrew Central European borders permanently. To understand why 80,000 Ottoman soldiers marched to their deaths at a river crossing, you need to understand the context of 1697, when all of Europe held its breath watching the largest Ottoman army assembled in decades march north like an unstoppable flood. For more than a decade, the Great Turkish War had dragged across the heart of the continent, pulling cities, farms, kingdoms, and entire regions into conflict with no clear end. People still remembered the terror of 1683 when the Ottoman Empire reached the walls of Vienna with over 100,000 troops in the largest siege of the war. Even 14 years later, families spoke about that moment as if it had happened yesterday. Fear like that stays in the blood. Now in 1697, word began to spread again. Quiet at first, then louder until no one could ignore what the messengers were saying. The Ottoman Empire was gathering a massive army, larger and more determined than anything Europe had seen since Vienna. Sultan Mustafa II wanted more than a routine campaign. He wanted a victory so overwhelming that Europe would remember it for generations. He wanted to erase every humiliation suffered since Vienna, rebuild every ounce of lost prestige, and prove that the empire was still a force capable of reshaping borders through military might. So he called his soldiers from every corner of the empire. Janissaries marched in long, perfect lines, their white turbans catching the sun. Sipahi cavalry rode beside them, their armor polished like mirrors. Anatolian riders, Balkan infantry, Crimean Tatar horsemen, cannon crews, engineers, blacksmiths, cooks, servants, wagon drivers poured into the roads until the army became a moving city that stretched for miles. Massive siege guns were pulled by teams of oxen. Wagon trains carried powder, tents, spare weapons, tools, and the Sultan's personal treasure. Green, red, and gold banners snapped in the wind, marking the advance of an empire that still believed in its destiny. Villagers said the ground shook long after the soldiers passed. Witnesses described the column as a river of metal, dust, leather, and sound, an entire world on the march. Europe heard the news, and fear returned immediately. Couriers raced through Vienna and across Habsburg lands. Reports came in from Serbia, Hungary, and the Danube frontier. Ottoman engineers were building supply depots, Tatar scouts were riding deep into the plains, and most alarming of all, the Sultan himself was leading the campaign. This was not a border raid. This was not a seasonal push. This was an empire moving with purpose. In the middle of this rising panic stood a commander who had spent most of his life being underestimated, Prince Eugene of Savoy. He was 34 years old, wasn't loud or imposing, but he was sharp, sharper than most gave him credit for. And he understood something that many in the imperial court refused to see. The Habsburg position was fragile, their forces were tired, their treasury was thin. If the Ottomans broke through Hungary again, Europe could face another disaster like 1683. When Eugene received word of the Ottoman march, he felt the weight of the moment immediately. If the Sultan's army moved fast, Hungary could fall again. If he hesitated, Vienna might be threatened again. If he waited for orders from the imperial court, it could already be too late. So he made a choice that would define his legacy. He gathered every soldier he could, German infantry, Austrian cavalry, Hungarian units, Serbian militia, anyone willing to fight. His army was smaller, poorer, and far less supplied than the Ottoman force, but it could move fast. And speed, he knew, was the one advantage the empire could not match with all its numbers and treasure. Eugene decided he would shadow the Ottoman army, follow their movements closely without being detected, and search for the one moment when their vast size would turn into a fatal weakness. Every great campaign had such a moment, a point where even the strongest army became vulnerable. He didn't know yet where that moment would appear. He didn't know yet when the Ottomans would slip. But the roads, both armies marched, the scouting paths they followed, the river crossings they approached, all of it was already leading them toward a place almost no one in Europe had heard of. A small town beside a slow, muddy river called Zenta. As the summer of 1697 unfolded, the Ottoman army moved north, like a living tide. Villages watched from doorways as endless lines of soldiers passed. Wherever the column went, dust filled the air and the roads shook under sheer weight. To the soldiers inside this massive machine, it felt as if the empire itself was marching beside them. But behind all the spectacle, a harsher truth traveled with them. The Ottoman army was huge, but it was slow. Its wagons stretched for miles. Its supply lines reached deep into territories already strained by years of war. Orders took too long to travel through the chain of command, and many officers worried more about pleasing the palace than winning battles. On the other side of the continent, Europe watched the advance like a looming storm. Reports flooded into Vienna. Ottoman scouts in the forests near the Tisza, supply caravans snaking through Serbia, bridge-building crews preparing crossings over the Danube. Each detail added weight to the realization that the Sultan wasn't simply testing borders, he was trying to reshape them permanently. Amid all of this stood Prince Eugene, studying maps that looked more like bruises than borders, territories scarred by years of raids, burned villages, lost fortresses, and shifting loyalties. Hungary was not a clean war zone. It was a patchwork of abandoned fields, refugee pathways, and towns divided between Ottoman supporters, Habsburg loyalists, and those who simply wanted the fighting to end. Eugene's army was smaller, but it was not weak. He commanded veteran German and Austrian infantry who had fought the Ottomans before. He had Hungarian units who knew every bend in the rivers and every ridge that offered good ambush points. He had Serbian militia capable of slipping through forests unnoticed. His cavalry was experienced, lean, and fast, and his best weapon of all, scouts who understood the land better than any map could show. Every day, information poured in. Small groups of Serbian riders shadowed the edges of the Ottoman march, slipping through marshes and wooded hills, sending back reports about troop numbers, marching speed, wagon movements, and the faint trails left by Tatar scouts. Bit by bit, Eugene pieced together a picture the imperial court couldn't see. The Ottoman army was heading toward the Tisza River. And when an army that large approached a river crossing, it always created the same moment, a moment where thousands of men, animals, guns, and supplies would be stuck between two banks, exposed and unable to fight at full strength. Eugene understood instantly what that meant. If he could reach the Tisza at the right time, he could end the entire campaign in one decisive strike, not through a siege, not through a drawn-out battle, but in a single moment where the empire's weight became its own weakness. Still, it was a gamble, a dangerous one. His army had to move faster than seemed humanly possible. They had to take rough roads, cross rivers at awkward points, and march without the rest they desperately needed. If they pushed too hard, the men could collapse from exhaustion. If they pushed too slowly, they would arrive too late and face a fully formed Ottoman army on the far bank. Worse, Vienna expected him to be cautious. Couriers rode back and forth with commands, urging him not to take unnecessary risks, not to gamble the empire's remaining strength on one throw of the dice. But Eugene had seen enough wars to know that hesitation could be fatal. He trusted his instincts, he trusted the intelligence coming from the Serbian scouts, and he trusted the one rule that had never failed him. The bigger the enemy force, the more fragile it becomes during a river crossing. By early September, the Ottoman army reached the wide, muddy stretch of the Tisza River near the small town of Zenta. To the soldiers who had marched for weeks, the river looked calm, slow, and harmless. But for an army of 80,000, a river was never harmless. It was a barrier that forced everything: men, horses, cannons, wagons, to compress into narrow lines and wait their turn. Still, the Ottomans believed they were safe. Their scouts reported no major enemy forces nearby. Their officers expected at least several quiet days to build a proper crossing. And with the Sultan himself overseeing the march, no one imagined a disaster waiting beyond the horizon.